Well, 2012 was a big year for development in the technology sector. Smartphones and tablets dominated the news with new developments. For more on this and what lies ahead in 2013, I'm joined now by technology reviewer Marc Fennell. Marc, welcome.
Hello, how are you?
Good. Now, when we asked you to come in and do this, the first thing you mentioned was 2012 was the rise of crowdsourcing. What is crowdsourcing?
Okay, so this is where you start to see services like Kickstarter and Possible here in Australia. And the way it works is that somebody can launch a project. It could be a short film, it could be an accessory for a phone. And what they do is they put up a video and they ask people to pledge money. And they set a target amount that they want to reach. And then people kind of pledge money. And then when they've hit their target, only when they've hit their target, people pay their money. And actually, the technology itself has actually been around for a couple of years. But this year, it was a huge explosion. And I think, you know, very much fueled by things like the ability to forward that stuff through social media. You saw a lot of really, really big projects get up. They hit their first $1 million project in about May this year. And towards the end of this year, you were starting to see projects hitting $3 million, $4 million. Now, what we haven't seen yet is a few high-profile failures. And I think that'll be very interesting to see what happens in 2013.
Was an example of crowdsourcing that one where they put the YouTube clip up where they were chasing the African rebel lord?
Oh, you're thinking of Joseph Kony.
Yeah.
No.
Is that an example of it or not?
Well, actually, I mean, in a sense, it is certainly an example of crowdsourcing in action.
Yeah.
I mean, it's hard to overstate the kind of the cultural impact something like Kony 2012 had on kind of conversations about viral culture and how quickly an idea can spread, possibly too quick in the case of Joseph Kony. This video, you know, really hit a nerve with a lot of different people, but it hit a nerve so fast that perhaps people weren't necessarily evaluating, is this the right way of dealing with an issue like Joseph Kony?
Yeah. But just getting back to the crowdsourcing thing, why wasn't this really an example of crowdsourcing?
Well, I'm thinking, when I talk about crowdsourcing, I'm specifically talking about services in terms of crowdfunding, so sourcing together money to run a project from the crowd. I think when you talk about something like Joseph Kony and the Kony 2012 campaign, that's more about trying to create a movement, as it were. And look, it's a fine, fuzzy and movable line. I think they're all different facets of a similar conversation.
So where could that go in 2013, that concept?
In terms of crowdsourcing, crowdfunding, or in terms of I think what it's probably likely to move into is equity funding, which I know is a super sexy idea. Everyone loves talking about equity funding on TV. But you know, back in the early days of startups, you'd need to get a venture capitalist to fund your next Facebook. These days, you actually don't necessarily need an organisation like that to get funding for your next startup. So the next Facebook, the next iPhone, maybe not hardware, but the next iPhone accessory could come from the users who have this investment in it, rather than some venture capitalist in Silicon Valley.
Okay, let's turn to the battle between the tech companies now. A few stumbles for Apple this year.
Yeah, it was an interesting year where a lot of the old dogs of the technology industry were trying to show that they could learn new tricks. And Apple, famously this year, the biggest fail in Apple's 2012 was their move into being a mapping company, which I still find quite hilarious, because my favourite thing about the Apple Map scenario is basically what happened was they wanted to limit their reliance on Google, because Google are becoming a major competitor in the smartphone market. And as part of that, there was some contract negotiations, and what they decided was they would buy up as many of the other mapping companies as possible and just churn out a map app for themselves and block the Google app. That did not work out so well. Obviously, a couple of weeks ago, we heard police saying, people driving in Mildura will get lost. My favourite story with Apple Maps is that Apple inadvertently solved an international diplomatic crisis between Japan and China, because there was a diplomatic crisis over who owned the Senkaku Islands. Apple Maps fixed it by just replicating the islands twice in the middle of the ocean. Genius.
Perfect.
Absolute genius.
So what was the other Apple stumble for the year?
I personally don't think that the Apple iPhone 5 was as exciting as it needed to be. This was the year where Android phones, Android's the operating system created by Google, and we're seeing tons of Apple phones and tablets, and halfway between phones and tablets, I call them phablets, flooding the market. And the problem is that because they're really getting a huge chunk of the market now, Apple needed to do something incredibly exciting to kind of recapture the conversation. And the iPad mini and the iPhone 5, to me, aren't necessarily that device yet. I'm looking to 2013 to see if they can release something that changes the game again, in the way that they did with the iPhone. And I'd be if they can't produce a device like that, I would be seriously questioning whether how much. Not, I mean, the company's not going to disappear, obviously, but I'd be curious to see what their future is as a market leader.
Yeah, in Australia, it seems Apple is so dominant, but I was surprised to hear in some Asian countries that is definitely not the case.
Yes, that is true, but even in Australia, though, I think this year there was a Telsite released a survey not that long ago saying that Android devices, there's a 44% of smartphones are Android devices and 43 are Apple devices. Now, that's slightly unfair because the way that that survey was done, it came just after the release of a major Android device. Right. Also, we're talking about 100 Android devices versus 6 Apple devices. Yeah. But still, I do think it's shifting, and I think Apple need to do something really interesting to reclaim that market.
Okay, in 2012, what happened in terms of music subscription services?
This, I think, is one of the biggest stories of 2012. Certainly within Australia, we saw the launch of music subscription services like Spotify and Rdio. So traditionally, at this point, I think we're fairly used to downloading song by song on things like the iTunes Store and whatnot. This year, the big thing that changed is you could have these services where you basically pay a subscription fee, so $9 a month, to get unlimited music streamed to your phone. Says the technology guy with a phone on his desk, which probably should be turned off. And it's actually, people that sign up to these things, it changes the way they listen to music because you can just listen to anything without having to go through that purchase process, which, let's be honest, was fairly easy to begin with. But the problem with it, and this is something that we're only now beginning to address, is that if you only pay $9 a month, how much goes back to the musicians? And from what I can work out, it varies between 0.05 cents to 0.02 cents per stream goes back to a musician. So, there are some real questions. If this is going to take off in the music industry, if this is going to become the dominant way people listening to music on their phones and tablets, what does that mean for the music industry? What's the knock-on effect? And we don't necessarily have an answer to that yet.
Okay, looking ahead to 2013, I was interested to see that you brought up MySpace, so a return of MySpace is a possibility?
Yes, I on my radio show on Radio National, Download the Show, it's become a frequent topic of conversation about how I think MySpace is going to make a return in 2013. So,
what happened to MySpace?
It was bought up by News Limited, who really don't seem to understand the internet when it comes to social media. Right. I'm sure I'm going to get horrible tweets about that. But basically, they sold it on to these two venture capitalists in the States called the Vanderhook brothers and Justin Timberlake. And they handed the job of completely rebranding MySpace over to an Australian company called Joseph Mark in Queensland. And they've done the most amazing rebrand of it. And if you look at it, it's a really beautiful way of streaming and finding new music. Now, they're only just rolling out now. It's got this left to right scrolling thing. It looks incredibly beautiful. And if they've got my personal opinion on it is if they've got a really solid mobile app that you can stream and discover music on it, they potentially have a Spotify killer or an Rdio killer on their hands.
Is that for free or are you paying?
Currently it's for free, and their plan is to run advertising on it. And I think the way the Vanderhook brothers described it to me was we want beautiful advertising. Nobody complains about the advertising in Vogue. We will see how that works out.
If you run advertising, isn't going to kill it?
Well, maybe. I mean, Spotify have a free tier where you can listen to everything on a desktop with advertising. The only problem is they've got like 6 ads, and they all sound the same. It's really irritating. So there's good advertising, there's bad advertising. Look, it remains to be seen, but it's an incredibly beautiful layout. The moment you log on to this new MySpace layout, it's not designed to take on Facebook. In fact, you can log on to new MySpace with your Facebook account. So it's really designed to take on music subscription services. And I think if they've got a solid mobile app, because let's be honest, phones are where we listen to our music now. If they nail that end of things, I think they've got a really solid product on their hands.
Cool. Looking forward to 2013. And it didn't matter that you bought your phone in and didn't
No,
turn it off because you
didn't
got
ring
no calls.
Nobody loves me. That's
Someone
what we learned.
call Marc Fennell.
Please, call me now. You wait, somebody will do it. Or not.
Cheers. Thanks a lot for that, Mark.